"I'll offer my entire salary if anyone can translate this," mocked the Millionaire CEO, laughing at the poor cleaning lady, unaware of who she was. But what happens when she steps up to the challenge and turns the tables? Leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this one ends. Enjoy the story. Peter Thompson stormed into the conference room like a hurricane, a crumpled envelope clenched in his hand. The polished marble floors of Griffin Imports reflected the harshness of his footsteps, making every executive in the room tense up. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, but his expression betrayed frustration as he glared at the group of highly paid professionals seated around the table. "This is unbelievable," Peter muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with disdain. He tossed the papers onto the table, causing them to scatter like playing cards in a game of chance. "Does anyone here even understand what this is? Basque. In this day and age, who sends documents in Basque?" The room fell silent as the executives exchanged uncomfortable glances, none of them daring to speak up. They all knew the problem. The document was important, yet none of them had the slightest idea how to make sense of it. Peter's frustration reached a boiling point. His fingers tightened around the crumpled envelope and his voice grew louder. "A company this size and we don't even have a single person who can translate a damn paper? How can we be expected to do business internationally if we can't even read one document from a client?" He turned his gaze to Mariana, his assistant, who had been standing quietly by his side, waiting for instructions. She swallowed hard, nervously running her fingers over the edge of her tablet. "I've called 4 translation agencies, sir. None of them can help today. Not even online services," she reported, her voice barely audible. Peter snapped. "Useless," he spat, spinning on his heels, his tone mocking as he paced across the room. "How about you, Mariana? Do you speak Basque? No? Then, who here can translate this?" With a mocking laugh, Peter threw up his hands in exasperation. "All right then," he sneered. "I'll give my entire month's salary, $150,000, to whoever can translate this correctly. You heard me, $150,000. Who's brave enough to take on the challenge?" The room erupted in nervous laughter, an awkward mix of discomfort and disbelief. Peter's offer, while extravagant, was nothing more than a joke to him. After all, who would have thought that any of his staff could understand such a niche language? They all knew they were far too qualified for such menial tasks, and none of them expected a single person to step forward. But then, to everyone's surprise, a soft voice broke through the murmurs. "I can translate it." The room fell into stunned silence as eyes darted toward the voice. Standing at the back of the room, near the water cooler with a mop in hand, was Rosie Monroe. Dressed in the wrinkled, light blue uniform of a cleaning lady, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, she stood as calm and collected as if she had just spoken up in a board meeting. Her face was slightly flushed from the physical labor of the morning, but her steady gaze never wavered. It was clear to Peter that this wasn't just some random attempt at attention-seeking. This woman meant business. Peter frowned, his mind working hard to process what he had just heard. "What?" he said incredulously, his voice dripping with disbelief. "I said," Rosie repeated, her tone unwavering. "I can translate it. I understand Basque." The executives exchanged confused looks, some of them even chuckling under their breath. One muttered, "This has to be a joke." Another whispered, "Yeah, right." But Rosie didn't flinch. She didn't back down. Instead, she walked confidently toward the table, her eyes fixed on the papers in front of Peter. Peter couldn't suppress his laughter, still in disbelief. "You? A cleaning lady? You know Basque?" he scoffed, crossing his arms and leaning back in his chair. The laughter in the room grew louder, but Rosie remained calm. She wasn't seeking anyone's approval. She simply wanted the opportunity. "I expect you to hand me the papers," she said coolly, holding out her hand with quiet authority. Peter hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to dismiss her or indulge her request. But something in the calm, steady look on Rosie's face stopped him. Without further argument, he reluctantly handed her the document, still snickering under his breath. As Rosie flipped through the pages, her eyes moved over the lines with remarkable ease. Her fingers traced the words, and she read silently for a few moments. Then she looked up, her voice calm but firm. "This is a notice of inheritance," she began. "A woman named Lourdes Garmendia passed away a month ago. She was your great-aunt on your mother's side. She left you a property and a substantial sum of money in Bilbao. The document says you are the only living heir." The room fell completely silent as Peter blinked, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. This wasn't just a translation. It was news that shook him to the core. The inheritance, something he had no idea existed, was now in his hands, and he had just learned of it from the most unlikely of sources. Peter's mind scrambled for words. This can't be real," he muttered, unable to grasp the situation. "I'm not buying it." But Rosie didn't flinch. "That's what it says," she replied coolly, not missing a beat. "And there's one more thing. The deadline to confirm acceptance of the inheritance is today, by 5 p.m. After that, the assets will be redistributed according to local law." Peter felt the weight of her words. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 3:03 p.m. His pulse quickened, panic creeping in. This was no joke. He quickly pulled out his phone and dialed the number for the Spanish consulate. His voice was urgent as he explained the situation. The executives and Mariana waited anxiously, their eyes glued to Peter as he spoke. When he hung up, his expression had changed completely. "It's official," he said, his voice now edged with disbelief and urgency. "This is legitimate." In that moment, Peter looked at Rosie with newfound respect. For the first time, he didn't see her as the cleaning lady. He saw her as someone who had saved him from making an irreversible mistake. His mind raced, the weight of his fortune now hanging in the balance. He needed to act fast. "I'll pay you, Rosie," Peter said, pulling out his checkbook. "Name your price." But Rosie's response was swift, and her eyes never wavered. "Just the amount you offered," she said flatly. "Your salary, $150,000. The room went quiet again, the magnitude of the situation dawning on everyone. Peter froze, his face reddening with the realization of what he had said in jest. He had mocked her, and now she was holding him to his word. As the silence lingered, he couldn't help but admire her. "Fine," he said reluctantly, his pride stung. He signed the check and handed it to her, feeling the sting of his earlier arrogance. "All right, I'll pay. But understand this. You're the one who saved my inheritance today." Rosie took the check, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her pocket. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice calm and unshaken. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Peter to reflect on the incredible turn of events. He had just lost a bet and learned a lesson he would never forget. Peter Thompson sat in his office, the check for $150,000 still burning a hole in his pocket. His mind raced as he replayed the events of the afternoon, still grappling with the absurdity of it all. He had been so sure that no one could translate the document, yet the cleaning lady, Julia as he learned her name, had effortlessly taken on the challenge. He could hardly believe it. There was something about her that didn't add up. His curiosity gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to Julia than met the eye. As the day wore on, Peter found himself increasingly fixated on the woman who had saved him from disaster. The more he thought about it, the more questions arose. How did she, a cleaning lady, know Basque? Was there something more to her than the role she played at Griffin Imports? He couldn't let it go. Peter had built an empire, but his business instincts had never failed him before. If Julia was as capable as she had shown, she couldn't possibly be content with mopping floors for a living. The next morning, Peter arrived early at the office, his mind still preoccupied with Julia. He had spent the entire night trying to figure out who she was, but nothing added up. Her background was a mystery. All he knew was that she had walked into that room, translated a document that had eluded his best employees, and left with $150,000 in her pocket. Peter's instincts told him that she was hiding something, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. At 9 a.m., Peter made his decision. He called Mariana into his office. "I need you to find out everything you can about Julia Monroe," he ordered, his tone more serious than usual. Mariana raised an eyebrow, but didn't question him. "Her work history, education, anything," Peter continued. "I want a full report by the end of the day." Mariana nodded and left, already typing away on her laptop. Peter leaned back in his chair, running his fingers through his blonde hair, his mind racing with possibilities. He had to know who Julia was. Hours later, Mariana returned with a thick file. She placed it on Peter's desk and he eagerly flipped it open. The first page was a resume. Julia Monroe, 34 years old, with a degree in linguistics from the University of Chicago. Peter felt his eyebrows raise in surprise. Linguistics? That wasn't what he had expected. She had a master's degree in translation and interpretation, and the next few pages revealed that Julia had worked as a diplomatic interpreter for several years, including a position at the U.S. consulate in Barcelona. Peter's shock deepened as he read on. Not only had she worked with high-profile diplomats and government officials, but she had also been involved in international negotiations, dealing with complex contracts and confidential documents. Julia Monroe wasn't just any translator. She was an expert, a professional who had worked in the highest echelons of diplomacy. Peter's heart pounded in his chest as he continued reading. There was a 2-year gap in her resume. Nothing listed, no jobs, no references. The file resumed 5 years ago when Julia had joined Griffin Imports as a cleaning lady. Peter's mind raced as he tried to piece the puzzle together. A highly qualified professional, working in some of the most prestigious settings, and now she was scrubbing floors. The contrast was staggering. Something had to have happened. Peter turned the page, his fingers trembling slightly as he read the next line. Reason for gap: personal. His curiosity intensified. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was a dark story behind those missing years. Peter leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. He had to know the truth. What had happened to Julia to make her take such a drastic turn in her career? He couldn't imagine any situation where someone as skilled and intelligent as Julia would willingly give up everything to clean toilets in an office building. Something had gone wrong. Something big. Peter's mind churned with possibilities. Later that afternoon, Peter found himself wandering down to the basement, where the cleaning supplies were stored. He had no plan, no particular reason for being there. But as he walked past the shelves, he spotted Julia organizing the cleaning products. She didn't see him at first, her attention fully focused on her task. Her blonde hair, now tied up in a neat bun, was still as disheveled as it had been the day before. Peter hesitated for a moment, but then he approached her. "Julia," he called out softly. She turned, her blue eyes locking with his, a neutral expression on her face. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice calm. She wasn't surprised to see him. In fact, she seemed almost indifferent. Peter cleared his throat, unsure of how to start. "I've been looking into your background," he said, his voice slightly tentative. Julia raised an eyebrow but said nothing, her eyes waiting for him to continue. Peter took a deep breath, deciding to get straight to the point. "I want to know what happened," he said. "Why did you leave your career as a translator and start working as a cleaning lady?" Julia's expression didn't change, but Peter could see the slight tension in her shoulders. "I had no choice," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter's curiosity spiked. "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. Julia hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady, but tinged with bitterness. "I used to work for a consulting firm. I was a senior translator and interpreter for international negotiations. It was a good job. But then I found something I wasn't supposed to. I uncovered a massive money laundering scheme involving shell companies, offshore accounts, and corrupt politicians." Peter's heart skipped a beat as he listened, but Julia didn't pause. "I tried to report it. I went to my boss, then the VP, but they told me to stay out of it. They ignored me. So I gathered evidence. I had documents, recordings, everything I needed to blow the whole thing wide open. But when I presented it, they fired me for professional incompetence and blacklisted me. They spread lies about me, ruined my career, and made sure no one would hire me." Peter's jaw clenched in anger as Julia's words sank in. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. "What happened next?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Julia let out a bitter laugh. "I lost everything. My reputation, my job, and I ended up alone. I didn't have the luxury of fighting anymore. So I moved to Chicago, started over. I needed to provide for my son, Noah." Her voice softened when she spoke about her son. Peter felt a pang of sympathy as she continued, her eyes distant. "I found work as a cleaning lady. It paid and it was steady. No one asked questions. And it gave me time to take care of Noah, who needs therapy every day. No matter what I went through, I couldn't let him down." Peter was silent for a moment, processing everything she had just shared. Julia had been wronged, and instead of breaking her, it had made her stronger. He couldn't help but feel guilty for how he had initially dismissed her. He looked at her, his respect for her growing. "Julia," he said softly. "I had no idea." She gave a small nod but said nothing. As Peter stood there, looking at the woman who had once been a high-powered translator, now cleaning floors, he realized something. Julia Monroe was a fighter, and if anyone deserved a second chance, it was her. Peter Thompson's mind was still racing as he left the basement, his thoughts consumed by the revelation Julia had shared with him. The story of her fall from grace hit him harder than he had expected. Julia had been betrayed by her own company, her career destroyed by powerful people who had no interest in justice. But what struck Peter most was the unwavering love she had for her son, Noah. He had seen many people in his life, from colleagues to business partners, but none had ever shown the kind of raw resilience Julia had. Her dedication to her son was palpable, and Peter realized then that her sacrifices weren't just for survival. They were for the future of a child who needed her. As the days passed, Peter found himself thinking more and more about Julia. He had always prided himself on his ability to analyze people, to understand their motivations, and yet Julia had slipped through the cracks of his initial judgment. It wasn't just her intelligence or her ability to solve complex problems that fascinated him. It was the depth of her character, her ability to endure hardship without losing her sense of self. But it was her love for Noah that truly tugged at his heartstrings. He had watched his parents struggle, but they had never faced the kind of relentless battle Julia did every day. Julia had made it clear she was not interested in charity, and Peter respected that. He had learned that her journey had been about survival, surviving the loss of her career, the destruction of her reputation, and the daily grind of providing for Noah. The more Peter learned about Julia, the more he wanted to help, but he knew it had to be on her terms. His mind kept returning to the question, how could someone so capable be stuck in a life that felt so beneath her? Peter's thoughts were interrupted one morning when he ran into Julia again, this time in the hallway on the 12th floor. She was pushing a cleaning cart, her face slightly flushed from the physical exertion of the task. Peter hesitated for a moment before walking up to her, his heart racing a little faster than usual. "Julia," he began, his voice softer than before, as though he were treading carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day." Julia paused in her work, but didn't look at him. "I didn't say anything I haven't already said," she replied in a calm tone, still not meeting his eyes. Peter took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I know, but I also know you've been through a lot, and I can't just sit here and pretend that I'm okay with it. You don't deserve to be in this position." Julia finally turned her gaze toward him, but her eyes held no trace of surprise. It was as if she had anticipated this conversation long before it ever happened. "I don't need your pity, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice steady and firm. "I don't need anyone to feel sorry for me. I'm fine. I'm doing what I need to do to take care of Noah." Peter frowned, feeling a mixture of frustration and admiration. He had never met anyone who could shut down an offer of help so quickly, and yet he found himself drawn to her strength. "I'm not offering pity," he replied, his tone sincere. "I'm offering you a chance, a real chance to get back on your feet. You're overqualified for this job. You're wasting your talents, Julia." She exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. "You think I don't know that?" she asked quietly. "But it's not about talent, Peter. It's about survival. It's about my son." Peter stood there, his mind racing. He knew she wasn't going to accept anything easily, but he couldn't shake the thought that she deserved so much more. "I know Noah is your priority," Peter said, his voice softer now. "But I also know that you're capable of so much more. You've been through hell, Julia. You shouldn't have to keep fighting battles like this every day." Julia's eyes softened for the first time, a brief flicker of vulnerability crossing her face. "You don't know what it's like," she said quietly. "You don't know what it's like to be on the other side of the world, doing everything right and still losing everything. You don't know what it's like to have no one stand by you when you need them the most." Peter didn't respond immediately, knowing there was no easy answer to what she had just shared. He had never experienced the kind of loss Julia had, but he could see the weight of her pain in her eyes, and it left him speechless. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened," Peter said, after a long pause. "I'm just offering you an opportunity to do something different. You don't have to do this anymore. You've already proven you're more than capable." Julia didn't say anything for a moment, and Peter could feel the tension in the air, heavy and thick. She finally nodded, her eyes locked on his. "You don't get it," she said quietly. "I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this for Noah. Everything I've done, every decision I've made, it's all for him." Peter's heart clenched at the mention of Noah's name. He could hear the love in Julia's voice, the same love he had heard in every word she spoke about him. She was willing to sacrifice everything for her son, and Peter realized that he had never truly understood the depth of a mother's love until now. Julia was not just a survivor. She was a warrior, fighting for the one person who mattered most in her life. "I understand that," Peter said softly, stepping closer. "I get it, Julia. But Noah deserves a better future, and so do you." Julia looked away, her gaze distant for a moment, before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want charity, Peter. I don't want anyone to hand me anything. If I'm going to make a change, I'll do it on my own. But if you can offer me a real opportunity, one where I can stand on my own 2 feet, then maybe, just maybe, I'll consider it." Peter could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't asking for handouts, and he respected that. He had known it from the moment he had first met her. Julia Monroe was not someone who would take the easy road. She was someone who fought for what she believed in. And as Peter stood there, looking at the woman who had unknowingly taught him more about strength and resilience than anyone else. He realized that he couldn't let her slip away. "I can do that," Peter said firmly. "I'll make sure it's an opportunity you can't refuse." Julia nodded, and for the first time in their conversation, a faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Then we'll see, won't we?" she replied, and Peter knew that this was just the beginning. As he walked away, Peter couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. Julia wasn't just a cleaning lady. She was a force to be reckoned with, and he was determined to help her reclaim the life she had lost. But it wasn't just about offering her a job. It was about giving her the respect she deserved. It was about showing her that she was worth more than the life she had settled for. And he would make sure she knew that every step of the way. The next morning, Peter Thompson sat at his desk, staring at the files spread out in front of him. He was supposed to be reviewing contracts, but his mind kept drifting back to Julia. Her words from the day before echoed in his head. "If I'm going to make a change, I'll do it on my own." He admired her resolve, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that she shouldn't have to do it alone. Peter had the power to change her life, but how could he convince her to trust him without crossing that fine line between helping and rescuing? He wasn't offering charity, he reminded himself. He was offering her a chance to reclaim what she had lost. But Julia was proud of the struggle she had endured, and he couldn't just give her an easy way out. He had to offer her something that would ignite her passion again. The door to his office swung open, and Mariana walked in, holding a tablet with her usual calm efficiency. "You asked for the background on Julia's previous work, Mr. Thompson," she said, handing him the device. "I've also compiled a list of all available roles within the company that she might be qualified for." Peter glanced at the list, his eyes narrowing as he scanned it. There were a few positions that Julia might fit, but none that seemed to truly honor her skill set. Peter leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk. "We need something bigger for her," he muttered to himself. Mariana, who had already seen her boss tackle much more complicated issues, tilted her head, sensing that something important was brewing. "What exactly do you mean?" she asked carefully. Peter didn't answer right away. His mind was racing through 1,000 scenarios. He had to come up with something that would challenge Julia, something that would reignite the drive he had seen in her all those years ago. "I want to offer her a real opportunity," he finally said. "Not just another job, but something that will let her use her full potential. Find me a position that requires an international scope, something where her skills in languages and diplomacy can shine." Mariana raised an eyebrow but didn't question him further. "Understood. I'll work on it." Later that afternoon, Peter found himself in the conference room, reviewing contracts with his senior executives. Despite the important business in front of him, his mind kept straying to Julia. He had promised her an opportunity, and now he was determined to make good on that promise. His eyes kept flicking to the door, wondering when she might walk in next to clean. The image of Julia scrubbing the floor with the same quiet determination she had shown when translating that document haunted him. She deserves better, Peter thought, his frustration mounting. He looked down at the contract in front of him, trying to focus, but his thoughts were consumed by Julia's face and the pain he had seen behind her eyes. It wasn't just her intelligence or talent that had captivated him. It was her ability to survive, to fight for what mattered most. At 4:30 p.m., Peter couldn't wait any longer. He called Mariana into his office. "I've thought about it," he said, his voice steady. "I want Julia to head our new international relations department." Mariana froze for a moment. "You want Julia to take on that kind of responsibility? But sir, she's only been with the company as a cleaning lady for the past few years." Peter cut her off. "I'm aware of that, but she's more than qualified. She has the expertise we need. She just doesn't know it yet. This department could be a game changer for us, but it needs someone who truly understands the complexities of international business. Someone who has lived and breathed it, not just in theory but in practice. Mariana hesitated, but then nodded, seeing the determination in Peter's eyes. "I'll make the arrangements," she said. Peter smiled, but there was a tightness in his chest. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Julia had a wall around her, built by years of hurt and disappointment. He would have to convince her that she was worth more than the job she had been doing, but he wasn't sure how she would react to such a big leap. As the days passed, Peter couldn't get Julia out of his mind. He'd spent years building his empire, making decisions that affected millions, but offering someone a new beginning, especially someone as proud as Julia, felt like the biggest gamble of his life. He could give her the opportunity, but it was up to her to take it. Peter knew he had to offer more than just a job. He had to give her a reason to believe in herself again. Finally, on the day he had planned to speak with her, Peter saw Julia standing in the hallway near the elevator. She was pushing her cleaning cart, her eyes focused on the task at hand, but Peter saw the weariness in her movements. He knew it wasn't just the physical labor that drained her. It was the emotional weight she carried. She looked up as Peter approached, her expression unreadable. "Julia," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've been thinking about our conversation." She stopped, turning slightly to face him, her eyes narrowing with curiosity. "What is it now, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, a touch of skepticism in her voice. Peter took a deep breath. "I want to offer you a position," he said. "I've created a new department at Griffin Imports, International Relations, and I want you to head it." For a moment, Julia didn't speak. She simply stared at him, her gaze piercing through him, as if trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. "What?" she asked finally, her tone flat. "You heard me," Peter said, his voice steady. "You're the most qualified person for the job. You've worked in international diplomacy. You understand complex negotiations, and you have the skills to handle high-stakes contracts. You're wasting your talents in this job, Julia." She crossed her arms, her face hardening. "And why would you want me to do this?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "You think I'm just going to walk into that office and forget who I am? Forget what I've been through?" Peter could feel the walls she had built around herself starting to rise again. He had expected this, but it still stung. "No," he said softly. "I'm not asking you to forget anything. I'm asking you to take control of your future. You deserve more than this. You've already proven that you're capable of greatness, Julia. You've been through hell, and you're still standing. I want to help you rise higher." Julia's eyes softened for a brief moment, but the hesitation was still there. She wanted to believe him, but trust wasn't something she gave away easily. "And what makes you think I'd want to work for you?" she asked, her tone defensive. Peter stepped closer, his voice lowering to a softer, more personal tone. "Because I believe in you, Julia, and I'm offering you a chance to prove that you're more than your past. You have the skills, the intelligence, and the drive. I'm just giving you a place where you can use them to the fullest." Julia's gaze flickered briefly, and for a moment, Peter saw a glimmer of the woman who had once been a diplomatic interpreter, strong, poised, and full of potential. But it was quickly replaced by the familiar wariness he had seen from her all along. She didn't respond immediately, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Peter knew he had given her a chance. Now, it was up to her to decide if she would take it. Julia stood at the window of her new office, looking out over the city. The skyline of Chicago stretched out before her, a stark reminder of how much her life had changed in the last few weeks. The glass walls of her office felt like a fortress, yet they were a cage too. Peter had given her the position of Director of International Relations at Griffin Imports, a role that matched her skills, but also threw her into a world she had once left behind. It had been a difficult decision, but the opportunity to create something meaningful for Noah, to ensure his future, had convinced her to leap. As much as she had wanted to turn down Peter's offer, as much as she had been afraid of what it might mean, she couldn't deny that this was the break she had longed for. She had worked too hard to let her son down now. However, despite the promise of a fresh start, the weight of her past still lingered. Julia had known from the beginning that her new role at Griffin Imports would not go unnoticed, especially by those who knew her story. She had been the whistleblower in the scandal that had nearly destroyed her career, and while Peter had been adamant about her deserving a second chance, she knew the whispers in the corridors would be louder here than anywhere else. The truth was, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't outrun the shadows of her past. That afternoon, Peter called a meeting with his senior executives to discuss an urgent matter. He had asked Julia to join, even though she was still settling into her new role. As she walked into the conference room, she could feel the eyes of the room on her. The once cold, indifferent atmosphere of the building had changed ever since she took the position, and now the air felt charged with the tension that always followed a scandal. Peter was already sitting at the head of the table, his posture rigid. He gave her a small nod of acknowledgement as she took her seat, but it was clear that something had shifted in his demeanor. Julia felt it immediately, the discomfort that hung in the air, as though everyone knew a storm was coming. "All right, everyone," Peter began, his voice steady but carrying an edge of urgency. "We have a problem. I need to address it head-on before it gets out of hand." Julia's stomach tightened. She had seen that look in Peter's eyes before, one of determination, mixed with the weight of a decision that could shake everything up. "What's going on?" James Morrison, the company's CFO, asked, his voice clipped. The tension in the room was palpable as Peter's gaze flicked toward Julia for a moment before he spoke again. "I've just been informed that our company's reputation is in jeopardy. There's a media leak about Julia's past." The words hit Julia like a punch to the gut. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing it out loud from Peter's mouth was different. It was real now. "What kind of leak?" Richard Hayes, the COO, asked sharply. His eyes narrowed as he looked between Peter and Julia. Julia could feel their scrutiny, and for the first time since taking the position, she wanted to shrink back, to disappear into the walls of her office. But she held her ground. "It's about the Meridian Global scandal," Peter explained. "Someone in the company has been feeding information to the press. They've connected Julia to the allegations she made years ago. It's all over social media, and now the press is asking questions." There was a collective pause in the room. No one spoke immediately, the silence thick with the weight of what Peter had just revealed. Julia's mind raced as she tried to process what this meant. She had known that her past could resurface at any moment, but she hadn't expected it to happen this soon. The media were already looking for a story, and they had found the perfect target. "What do we do about it?" Richard asked, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone. Peter's expression remained composed, but Julia could see the tension in his jaw. "We need to control the narrative," he said firmly. "I'll issue a statement supporting Julia, and we'll make sure the truth is out there. We can't let this affect the company's operations, but we also can't allow anyone to tarnish her reputation any further." Julia felt a strange mixture of gratitude and anxiety. She was grateful that Peter was backing her, but part of her still couldn't shake the fear of being dragged into a public spectacle once again. It was one thing for her to fight quietly behind the scenes, but being thrust into the spotlight again, this time with the added responsibility of the company's reputation, felt like too much. "It won't be that easy," James said, breaking the silence. His voice was blunt, and Julia knew he didn't have much faith in Peter's ability to resolve the issue smoothly. The media is already running wild with rumors. We've already seen a drop in stock prices, and some clients have pulled back on their contracts. We need to act fast or it'll cost us millions. Julia's heart sank as she listened to the discussion unfold. Peter was trying to protect her, but there was little he could do to stop the damage the scandal had already caused. She could feel the weight of the company's future pressing down on her shoulders, and it made her want to run again. But where would she go? She couldn't hide forever. "I understand the concerns," Peter said, his voice growing more authoritative. "But this company has always prided itself on doing the right thing. Julia was wronged. We know that. But now we're going to do right by her. The truth is on our side." He looked directly at Julia, his eyes softening. "And I'm not letting anyone use her past against her." The room was quiet for a moment as everyone absorbed Peter's words. But then, as if the dam had broken, the tension turned into frantic energy. Richard began making phone calls to the legal team, while James was already on his laptop, drafting a statement for the press. Peter turned to Julia. "We're going to get through this," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "I'm not going to let them destroy what you've worked so hard for." Julia's chest tightened, and she could feel her throat closing up. She had fought so hard to build her life, to protect her son, and now it felt like everything was slipping away again. She wanted to tell Peter that she didn't need anyone to fight for her, but the words stuck in her throat. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure she had the strength to fight alone anymore. Later that day, Julia walked back to her office, her thoughts clouded with uncertainty. The scandal had already begun to spread, and the media would only amplify the damage. She had worked so hard to escape the past, but now it had caught up with her again. But as she sat at her desk, trying to focus on the contracts in front of her, she realized something. No matter how hard the world tried to tear her down, she wasn't going to let it break her again. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. Not for herself, and certainly not for Noah. As the storm of the scandal raged on, Julia knew one thing for sure. No matter how many times her past tried to destroy her, she would rise again. This time, she wouldn't be the one to fall. She would be the one who stood tall. And with Peter by her side, she had a chance to finally reclaim her life. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, legal consultations, and press statements. The scandal surrounding Julia had escalated beyond their control. It was no longer just an internal matter for Griffin Imports. It was a media storm, with rumors flying faster than they could manage. Despite Peter's best efforts to protect her, the press had gotten hold of the details of the Meridian Global case. And every time a reporter asked for a comment, the company's reputation suffered. Julia could feel the pressure mounting, her every step scrutinized by the public eye. The weight of the world seemed to be resting on her shoulders, and she was struggling to keep her composure. Yet, as much as the situation seemed overwhelming, there was a part of her, buried deep within, that refused to back down. She wasn't going to let the truth be twisted. Peter, meanwhile, had been working tirelessly behind the scenes. He was determined to clear Julia's name, but he knew it would take more than just a few well-written statements. He had been in constant contact with legal teams, pushing for transparency, but there were moments when the pressure got to him too. Despite all his efforts, it seemed like the world was still against them. There was only one way out of this, one final move that would change everything. Peter knew that to truly clear Julia's name, they needed hard evidence. The truth was buried somewhere, and it wasn't just about defending her. It was about exposing the corruption that had destroyed her career in the first place. Julia sat at her desk, her hands folded in front of her, staring blankly at the screen. She had not spoken to Peter about it, but she could feel the walls closing in. The constant media inquiries, the legal documents piling up. It was becoming suffocating. But in the quiet moments, when she allowed herself to think, a part of her clung to something stronger than fear. The truth. It was the one thing she could control, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before it all came to light. Still, the silence in her office felt like a thick fog. Her phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was Peter. "Julia," he said, his voice urgent. "We've got a breakthrough." Her heart skipped a beat and she leaned forward. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to steady her voice. "The FBI reached out," Peter continued, his tone sharp. "They've been investigating Meridian Global's financials, and we've got solid evidence that backs up your claims. They've reopened the case." Julia's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the vindication she had been waiting for. "What does this mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Peter's voice softened. "It means that the truth is coming out. The evidence you gathered all those years ago. It's finally being used to bring down the people who ruined your life. The FBI is going to take it to court, and they want you to testify." Julia sat back, her hands shaking. The weight of the offer, the enormity of the situation, was almost too much to comprehend. Testifying meant facing her past head-on, but it also meant bringing justice to those who had silenced her. She had always known that she would have to fight again, this time with the power of truth behind her. But there was a part of her that hesitated. It wasn't just the fear of reliving the betrayal, the threats, or the lies. It was the fear of what would happen next. If she exposed everything, what would the world think of her? Could she handle the scrutiny once more? Peter's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "We are going to do this together, Julia," he said firmly. "You're not alone anymore. We'll make sure the truth is heard. You've already done the hardest part. You've survived. Now, we take the fight to them." His words were a lifeline, pulling her back from the brink. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced by the system, for those who had been crushed under the weight of corruption. The next few days felt like a blur. Julia worked closely with the FBI team, going through the evidence she had kept hidden for so long. She had gathered recordings, documents, and emails that proved beyond a doubt that Meridian Global had been laundering money for years. It was the same pattern that had led to her dismissal. She had never imagined that the very evidence that had been dismissed as inadmissible would become the foundation for the largest corruption case of the decade. With each piece of evidence she uncovered, she felt a sense of purpose rising within her. This was her moment. This was the chance to set the record straight. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. Julia sat in the witness stand, the eyes of the courtroom focused solely on her. The tension in the air was palpable. Journalists filled the benches, their pens poised and ready to capture every word she spoke. The prosecutor stood before her, asking questions, guiding her through the years of corruption she had witnessed firsthand. It was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she would no longer be a victim, but a voice for the truth. As Julia spoke, she felt the weight of the years she had carried lift off her shoulders. She talked about the fraudulent contracts, the fake companies, and the threats she had received when she tried to expose the truth. The courtroom was silent as she recounted the events that had led her to become the target of a multi-billion-dollar conspiracy. When the prosecutor asked about the phone calls, the threats, the empty promises made by the higher-ups at Meridian, Julia didn't hesitate. She pulled out the flash drives, the documents, the recordings, the evidence that had once been dismissed and now stood as the foundation for her testimony. As the evidence was played for the court, the room grew tense with disbelief. There was no denying it now. The people who had tried to destroy her were finally being exposed for what they were. By the time the trial ended, Julia felt a sense of relief she had never known. The case was far from over, but the tide had turned in her favor. The next few weeks saw the downfall of Meridian Global. Executives who had once held power in the corporate world were arrested, their careers crumbling under the weight of the corruption they had orchestrated. The press, which had once been a fierce adversary, now turned its attention to the triumph of truth. And all the while, Peter stood by her side, supporting her every step of the way. When the case finally closed, with convictions handed down to those who had wronged her, Julia knew that the battle had been worth it. She had fought not only for herself, but for every person whose voice had been silenced. She had stood tall in the face of overwhelming odds, and she had won. As she walked out of the courthouse, her head held high, Peter was there, waiting for her. "You did it," Peter said, his voice full of admiration. "We did it," Julia replied, her voice steady. The weight of the past was finally behind her, and the future stretched out before her, bright, open, and full of possibilities. She had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her future. It was the beginning of something new, something that would change everything. The months following Julia's testimony in the federal case were some of the most transformative of her life. Griffin Imports had regained its footing, and the media storm surrounding the scandal had finally subsided. The company's image was restored, not just because of the evidence Julia had provided, but because of how Peter Thompson had stood by her throughout the ordeal. He had protected her when no one else would, and now it was clear that his feelings for her had grown into something deeper than mere professional respect. Julia had noticed the subtle shifts in his behavior, his eyes lingering a little longer when they spoke, the way he made sure to check in on her, both professionally and personally. It wasn't just about business anymore. Peter had become a constant in her life, offering support, comfort, and something she hadn't realized she needed: stability. One chilly autumn evening, after a long day of meetings, Peter invited Julia to dinner at a restaurant he had reserved in advance. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was intimate, just the two of them. As they sat across from each other, the glow of candlelight illuminating their faces, Julia couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment that she hadn't experienced in years. They spoke about everything and nothing at all: work, Noah, their favorite books, and how the city had changed over the years. Julia realized for the first time how easy it was to be with Peter. There were no walls between them anymore, no pretense. It was just them, talking, laughing, sharing a moment of peace in a world that had been anything but kind. As the evening wore on, Peter's demeanor shifted. He seemed quieter than usual, and Julia could feel his nervous energy even before he spoke. "Julia," he began, his voice low and steady, but there was something in it, an edge that made her heart skip a beat. "We've been through a lot together, and I want to be honest with you. I'm not sure how to say this, but I need to say it." Julia's gaze softened, sensing the seriousness in his tone. She reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. "Peter," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "you know you can say anything to me." Peter took a deep breath, looking into her eyes, and for a moment, Julia saw something there, something raw, vulnerable and real. "Julia," he continued, his voice slightly shaking, "what I'm trying to say is that over these past months, I've realized something. I've come to care for you in a way I never thought possible. You've become so much more than just a colleague to me. You've become someone I can't imagine my life without." Julia felt her chest tighten. She hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared herself for it. Her heart raced, and she could feel the weight of his words sinking in. Peter paused, as if unsure of how to continue. But then, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Julia's breath caught in her throat as Peter opened it, revealing a sparkling diamond ring. "Julia," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't want to live another day without you by my side. I know we've both been through so much, but I believe in us. I believe in what we've built together, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" The world seemed to pause as Julia stared at the ring, her mind swirling with thoughts and emotions. This wasn't just a proposal. It was a new beginning, a chance to build a future together, a future that had seemed so uncertain not too long ago. But now, standing in front of her, was the man who had stood by her through it all. Peter Thompson, who had helped her rise from the ashes of her past. For a moment, Julia was silent. She felt as if she were standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure of what lay ahead. But she also felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had fought so hard to protect Noah, to give him a life filled with love and stability. Now, for the first time in years, she realized that she could have the same thing for herself. Peter was not just offering her a ring. He was offering her a chance to live a life of honesty, love, and trust, things she had once lost but had found again in him. Julia looked at Peter, her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel something she had buried deep inside: hope. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, I will marry you." Peter's face broke into a smile, and he stood up, pulling her into a tight embrace. Julia felt the weight of the past, the pain, the struggles melt away in that moment. She wasn't just Julia Monroe, the cleaning lady or the whistleblower anymore. She was Julia, the woman Peter loved, and she had a future worth fighting for. As they left the restaurant, Peter held her hand tightly, and they walked out into the crisp night air. For the first time, Julia felt like she was walking towards something better, something lasting. As the lights of the city twinkled in the distance, she realized that the path ahead was uncertain, but with Peter by her side, she was no longer afraid. In the days that followed, the world seemed to shift around them. The media, which had once been relentless in their pursuit of Julia's past, now turned their focus on her future. The story of her rise from the ashes of the scandal had captured the public's attention, and now, the narrative was one of hope and redemption. Julia, once the woman whose voice had been silenced, was now a symbol of strength and resilience. And Peter, standing beside her, was more than just her fiancé. He was the man who had helped her reclaim her life, and together they were ready to face whatever challenges the future held. As the wedding day drew closer, Julia found herself reflecting on everything she had been through. She had never imagined that she would find love again, let alone in the arms of someone like Peter. He had shown her that there was still beauty in the world, good in people, and that even the darkest pasts could lead to a bright future. She had never felt more alive than she did now, standing beside the man who had helped her rediscover herself. And for the first time, Julia knew that she had a future worth dreaming about. The day before their wedding, as they sat together on the balcony of their apartment, Peter turned to Julia, his gaze soft but unwavering. "I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with you," he said quietly. Julia smiled, her heart full. "Neither can I," she replied, her voice filled with certainty. And as they watched the sun set over the city, Julia realized that the love they had found together was the greatest victory of all. The morning of their wedding day arrived with a soft, golden light spilling over the city, illuminating everything in its warm embrace. Julia stood by the window of their apartment, looking out at the skyline that seemed so distant just a few years ago. The city had always felt like a cage, a reminder of everything she had lost. But today, it felt different. Today, it felt like home. The past, with all its heartbreak, betrayal, and loss, was behind her now. And in its place was a future filled with hope and promise. Peter, standing behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist and placed a kiss on her shoulder. "Are you ready?" he asked softly, his voice full of anticipation. Julia smiled, turning in his arms to face him. "More than ready," she replied, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of excitement and calm. She had waited for this moment for so long, and now that it was finally here, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had found her place, by Peter's side, and nothing could take that away from her. The wedding ceremony itself was a blur of laughter, tears, and heartfelt vows. Friends, family, and colleagues gathered to celebrate the union of two people who had fought through unimaginable odds to find each other. The reception was held at an elegant venue overlooking the city, a place that had once been out of reach for someone like Julia. But today, she was no longer the woman defined by her past. She was the woman who had reclaimed her future, and it was filled with love. Peter had spared no expense, ensuring that every detail of the day was perfect. But what Julia remembered most was the way Peter looked at her as they danced their first dance. It wasn't just love that shone in his eyes. It was respect, admiration, and a promise of forever. As they moved together on the dance floor, Julia felt like she was floating, her heart light with happiness and gratitude. No more shadows were lurking in the corners of her mind, no more fears about the future. She had found her peace, and it was in Peter's arms. As the night wore on, the celebration continued, but Julia and Peter slipped away for a few moments of quiet. They stepped out onto the terrace where the city lights sparkled beneath them and stood together in the cool breeze. Julia leaned against the railing, looking out over the view, her heart full of contentment. Peter joined her, standing close but giving her the space she needed to take in the moment. "I can't believe it's real," Julia said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd get here. I never thought I'd have this kind of happiness again," Peter smiled, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "You deserve all of it, Julia. All the happiness in the world." She turned to him, her eyes searching his face, as if she were trying to memorize every detail. "I still can't believe you asked me to marry you," she said, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "Why?" Peter asked, his voice gentle. "Because after everything that happened, I thought I was damaged, unworthy of love." Peter shook his head, his expression serious. "You were never damaged, Julia. You were just waiting for the right person to see you for who you truly are. I saw that in you from the moment we met." Julia felt a wave of emotion wash over her, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to truly believe in the love they shared. Peter had seen her at her lowest, and yet he had never judged her. He had supported her when the world turned its back on her, and now, as they stood together, she knew that this was where she was meant to be. "I love you," Julia said, her voice thick with emotion. "I love you too," Peter replied, his voice steady, unwavering. They stood there for a while, the city stretching out before them, the world full of possibilities. The life they had dreamed of was within their grasp, and together they would build it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of new beginnings. Julia took her place as the head of the newly expanded International Relations Department at Griffin Imports. Her role, which had once seemed impossible, was now hers to shape, and she threw herself into it with the same determination she had always possessed. The work was challenging, but Julia found herself thriving in the environment Peter had helped create, a place where she could finally use her skills and expertise to make a real difference. She wasn't just the woman who had been wronged anymore. She was a powerful force in the business world, a leader in her own right. And Peter, ever the supportive partner, was right there by her side, guiding her when needed and letting her take the reins when it was her turn. Noah, too, began to flourish in ways that Julia had never imagined. With the help of the new therapies Peter had arranged for him, Noah made tremendous strides. He spoke more, interacted with others, and showed a level of growth that left Julia and Peter both in awe. Julia had always believed that Noah would have a bright future, But seeing him thrive in the ways he was now, seeing him laugh, speak, and connect with the world, was a dream come true. As the days passed, it became clearer that the family they had built together was growing stronger, and that the future, despite all the obstacles they had faced, was now theirs to shape. One evening, after another long day at work, Peter and Julia sat in their living room, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. Noah was asleep, his small form nestled comfortably in his bed. The quiet of the house was a stark contrast to the hustle and bustle of their daily lives. And for a moment, Julia allowed herself to simply be in the moment. Peter sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, as they watched the fire burn. "I can't believe how far we've come," Julia said, her voice soft with wonder. "It feels like a dream," Peter smiled, pulling her closer. "It's not a dream, Julia. It's our reality. We've fought for it, and now we have it. A life we've earned." Julia looked up at him, her heart full. "And it's just the beginning, isn't it?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. "It is," Peter replied, kissing the top of her head. "Just the beginning." As they sat there in the quiet of their home, Julia realized that she had everything she had ever wanted. She had a partner who loved her, a son who was thriving, and a future that was full of promise. The darkness of her past had been replaced with the light of a new life, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. The journey that had started in pain and loss had led her here, to a life she never thought possible, filled with love, joy, and a future full of infinite possibilities. Together, she and Peter would face whatever came next, and with Noah by their side, they would build a life more beautiful than either of them had ever dreamed. The past was behind them, and the future was wide open. And as the fire flickered in the hearth, Julia knew that they were ready for whatever came next. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey with Julia and Peter. Their story of resilience, love, and redemption is a testament to the power of second chances and the strength of the human spirit. We'd love to hear your thoughts on their journey. How did their story resonate with you? Please feel free to share your comments below. Thank you for your support, and we can't wait to bring you more inspiring stories in the future. Until next time, take care and stay inspired.